Across the burning sands of Africa, Rome's pride was shattered. A former ally, Jugurtha of Numidia, turned traitor, slaughtering princes, defying the Senate, and mocking the legions with bribes and bloodshed. Rome, the mistress of the Mediterranean, found herself humiliated in the desert. Yet from this storm of corruption and defeat, a new name would rise, not from patrician blood, but from the dust of the common people, a man whose reforms would forge Rome's future in steel and fire. His name was Gaius Marius. Stay with us as we unravel Rome's darkest humiliation in Africa, betrayal, corruption, and the birth of a military revolution. Witness how one man turned disaster into destiny. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us as we march into the fire of history. In the year 112 BC, the African sun blazed mercilessly over the kingdom of Numidia, a land of deserts and rugged hills where the horse was king and speed was survival. Here Rome had once believed it had secured a loyal ally in Jugurtha, the adopted grandson of the famed king Massinissa, who had long stood by Rome's side against Carthage. Jugurtha himself had even served under Scipio Aemilianus at the siege of Numantia, earning Roman respect for his valor and cunning. But Rome, blinded by arrogance and lulled by Jugurtha's charm, had underestimated the ambition that simmered in the Numidian prince's heart. When Jugurtha seized the throne of Numidia through murder and treachery, Rome should have acted swiftly. Instead, the Senate hesitated. Gold flowed like water through the streets of Rome, filling the coffers of corrupt senators who accepted Jugurtha's bribes with eager hands. In a single stroke, Jugurtha secured legitimacy from Rome's highest council, not through the sword but through silver. The people of Rome muttered in anger, but the decision was sealed. Jugurtha was king. Yet Jugurtha was no grateful client. His reign was drenched in blood. To secure his crown, he slaughtered his rivals, noble princes of the royal house, men who had once sought Rome's protection. Their screams echoed through the palaces of Numidia, their blood soaking the very sands that had once drunk the blood of Carthage. The massacre was more than a crime. It was a challenge, a direct insult to Rome's prestige. When word reached the Eternal City, the Senate could no longer remain still. Rome would march to Africa once more. But the legions that came were not the iron phalanxes of Scipio, nor the disciplined veterans who had broken Hannibal. Instead, Rome sent commanders who craved wealth more than glory, men who had paid their way into power and expected war to reward their greed. Jugurtha, a master of cunning, knew his enemy well. He welcomed Rome's armies not with battle, but with bribes. Gold bought truces, silver dissolved campaigns, and generals returned to Rome with excuses and promises, their purses heavy, but their honor lost. For the soldiers, the war was hell. The Numidian cavalry, swift as desert winds, struck without warning. They harassed supply lines, set ambushes in the rocky hills, and vanished into the dunes before the heavy Roman infantry could react. Roman columns, exhausted and demoralized, marched under the burning sun only to find their wells poisoned, their allies slaughtered, their scouts missing. The discipline of the legions began to fray. Soldiers cursed their commanders, cursed the Senate, and cursed the gods who seemed to have abandoned them. One disaster followed another. In the ravines and deserts of Africa, entire cohorts were cut down, their standards captured, their survivors left to wander or fall into enemy hands. At one infamous moment, a Roman army was forced to pass under the yoke, a humiliation so grave it recalled the darkest days of the Caudine Forks, centuries before. Rome's enemies rejoiced, her allies trembled, and in the Forum the people roared with fury. "Our leaders sell our blood for gold," cried the tribunes, as the plebeians demanded justice. Jugurtha, emboldened, mocked Rome openly. He declared that in Rome, everything has a price. It was a phrase that spread like fire, a bitter truth that shamed the Republic. Senators whispered nervously, generals feared exposure. For never before had Rome's dominance been so stained by corruption. Never before had her legions been so cheaply bought and broken. The crisis was more than military. It was a wound to Rome's very soul. The Republic prided itself on virtue, discipline, and the unbending will of its citizens. Yet in Africa, all these values seemed to crumble into dust. The people of Numidia laughed at Roman blunders. Carthage's ruins stood as a silent witness, proof that Rome had once been mighty, yet here she faltered, beaten not by strength but by deceit. By the close of 112 BC, the war in Numidia had become a stain upon the Republic's honor. Defeat after defeat, betrayal after betrayal, revealed a terrifying truth. Rome was not invincible, and as the smoke of burning villages curled into the African sky, the world watched to see whether the mistress of the Mediterranean would fall from her throne. Rome's tragedy had begun, not with a great battle lost, but with her honor sold to the highest bidder. Amid the dust and disgrace of Rome's African war, the Republic searched desperately for a savior. The Senate was paralyzed by its own corruption, generals returned in shame, and the plebeians howled for vengeance. Yet the answer did not come from the old patrician bloodlines, nor from the gilded halls of aristocracy. It came from the humblest of origins, from a man born not into privilege but into obscurity, Gaius Marius. Marius was no child of fortune. Born in 157 BC in the small village of Arpinum, far from the marble splendor of Rome, he was raised in the hard soil of Latium, where labor built endurance and survival bred discipline. His family was equestrian, respectable, but far from the ruling elite. In Rome's rigid society, he was an outsider, a man without the noble ancestry that opened doors to consulships and triumphs. Yet within Marius burned an ambition as fierce as any aristocrat's, and unlike the pampered sons of patricians, he would forge his destiny with his own hands. As a young man, Marius earned his reputation in the army. He was not tall or handsome in the way Roman nobles admired, but he was relentless. His soldiers respected his endurance, his willingness to share their hardships, his refusal to demand privileges. In Spain, serving under Scipio Aemilianus, the same legendary general who razed Carthage, Marius distinguished himself for both courage and discipline. Scipio, recognizing his potential, is said to have remarked to his officers, "In this man, there is the stuff of which Rome's salvation will one day be made." That prophecy lingered, for Marius was determined to rise where others dismissed him. He studied the art of war, not from scrolls and speeches, but from the field itself, learning how men fought, how armies broke, how commanders failed. He observed that Rome's traditional reliance on citizen farmers was faltering. Too many were ruined by years of war, their lands lost, their service unsustainable. He understood that Rome's military machine, once her greatest strength, was decaying from within. By the 120s BC, Marius had entered Roman politics, aligning himself not with the conservative Senate, but with the popular cause of the people. He spoke plainly, without the ornate rhetoric of the patricians, but his words cut like iron. The plebeians, weary of aristocratic corruption, saw in him a champion, one of their own who sought not wealth, but Rome's honor. Slowly, step by step, he climbed the ladder of offices, always meeting resistance from those who sneered at his humble birth. But every time the elite tried to bar his way, he answered with deeds instead of words. The crisis in Africa gave him his chance. When the Senate stumbled and generals failed, Marius was serving as a legate under Quintus Caecilius Metellus, the latest patrician commander sent against Jugurtha. Metellus was competent and disciplined, unlike his predecessors, and under his leadership, Rome at last began to recover some measure of dignity. But it was Marius who caught the soldiers' eyes. While Metellus upheld patrician distance, Marius walked among the men, listened to their grievances, endured their hardships. He fought alongside them, ate their rations, shared their thirst beneath the African sun. The rank and file adored him, calling him not lord but leader. Marius, however, was not content to remain second in command. He saw that the war dragged on endlessly because of Jugurtha's cunning and Rome's corruption. He saw, too, that Metellus, bound by aristocratic pride, hesitated to break tradition or to strike boldly. Marius began to whisper of a new path, of reforms that would arm Rome not just for Numidia, but for the future. He envisioned legions drawn not merely from landowning citizens, but from the poor, men who had nothing but their bodies, yet who could become warriors if given training and arms. It was a radical vision, one that threatened the old order. When Marius returned to Rome to seek the consulship in 107 BC, he campaigned not on noble ancestry, but on results. He promised to end the disgrace in Africa, to capture Jugurtha once and for all, and to give Rome a military reborn in strength. The Senate sneered, dismissing him as a novus homo, a new man, an outsider without noble blood. But the people remembered the shame of the war, the corruption of the Senate, the humiliation of the legions. They rallied behind Marius, lifting him to the consulship, making him the first man from his family to ever hold such power. The moment was historic. For centuries, Rome had been governed by patricians, their power inherited and their victories celebrated as the natural right of nobility. Now, for the first time in generations, a commoner stood at the summit of Roman politics, holding not only the will of the people, but also the fate of the Republic's armies. His election was a defiance of tradition, a cry that Rome's salvation would come not from the old elite, but from new blood, hardened by toil and ambition. As consul, Marius wasted no time. He demanded command in Numidia, despite the Senate's reluctance. He declared that Jugurtha would be brought to Rome in chains, that the Republic's honor would be restored. His enemies scoffed, but the people cheered. Here was a man who did not fear Jugurtha's tricks, nor the bribes that had ensnared so many before. Here was a man of iron will, unbending and incorruptible, a soldier's general who carried the hopes of Rome into the blazing deserts of Africa. Thus the stage was set. From the dust of Arpinum, from the ranks of the common soldier, Gaius Marius rose as the hero Rome had long awaited. He was not polished like the patricians, nor bound by their traditions. He was something new, something dangerous. And in his hands, the war against Jugurtha would no longer be a tale of shame, but the beginning of a revolution that would forever change Rome's destiny. While Gaius Marius rose like a storm on the horizon, the city of Rome itself trembled under the weight of crisis. The war in Numidia had dragged on for years, draining coffers, consuming lives, and staining the Republic's pride. In the Senate, voices clashed like swords, not over how to save Rome, but over how to preserve privilege and profit. The very heart of the Republic, the Senate that claimed to embody Roman virtue, was revealed to be fractured, fragile, and corrupt. Senators whispered in their marble halls, their togas stained not with blood but with bribes. Some argued that Jugurtha was too elusive, that Numidia was not worth the price of endless campaigns. Others, fattened by Jugurtha's gold, spoke openly in his defense, calling for treaties that would secure their purses rather than Rome's honor. Every debate became an echo of self-interest, every vote tainted by suspicion. The people who once trusted the Senate to guide Rome through storm and fire now muttered in the streets, "Who governs us? Patriots or traitors bought with silver?" The corruption was no secret. Jugurtha himself, with a sneer upon his lips, was said to have mocked Rome. A city for sale, if only a buyer can be found. His words spread like a plague through the forum, repeated by plebeians and patricians alike, each repetition a dagger in the Senate's reputation. To the Roman people, it was no longer simply a war fought in distant deserts. It was a mirror reflecting the decay of their republic. Outside the Senate's gilded chambers, anger boiled. The plebeians filled the forum, demanding accountability for the disasters in Africa. Mothers cried for sons who had perished beneath the Numidian sun. Veterans returned scarred, not with glory, but with humiliation. They told tales of generals who feasted while their men starved, of officers who sold safe passage in exchange for coin, of soldiers abandoned to thirst and death while Rome's leaders haggled over profits. The voice of the mob grew louder with each defeat, a chorus of rage that shook even the most arrogant senators. The tribunes of the people seized this fury, hurling accusations at the nobility. Trials were called, and though many guilty men escaped true punishment, some were dragged into court, their names disgraced. It was not enough to cleanse the Republic, but it was enough to reveal the rot. A generation that had grown up hearing of Scipio's triumphs and Rome's greatness now looked upon their leaders and saw only weakness. The image of Rome as the eternal conqueror, chosen by the gods to rule, was cracking. The crisis was not only political, it was spiritual. Rome's identity had always rested upon virtues, the manly courage of her citizens, and disciplina, the unbreakable discipline of her legions. Yet both virtues seemed to wither under the African sun. Soldiers complained that their sacrifices were meaningless, that their leaders betrayed them before the enemy even struck. Recruitment faltered. Families hesitated to send their sons to die in a war that brought only shame. In taverns and workshops, in markets and temples, the question lingered: had the gods abandoned Rome? Meanwhile, Rome's allies watched with unease. Italian towns bound to the Republic by treaties saw their men drafted to fight in Africa, only to be wasted in futile campaigns. Resentment brewed quietly, a foreshadowing of storms yet to come. Beyond Italy, provinces whispered of weakness. Carthage had fallen, Corinth had been crushed. But if Jugurtha could humiliate Rome, who else might dare to rise? The very foundations of the Republic's dominion trembled. In the Senate, the divide sharpened between the optimates, the conservatives who clung to tradition, and the populares, those who sought power by championing the people. Each side blamed the other for the crisis. The optimates insisted that only noble blood could restore order, accusing reformers of undermining Rome's greatness. The populares pointed to corruption, declaring that Rome's salvation lay not with the aristocracy, but with leaders of true merit, men like Marius. The Republic itself seemed to teeter, not on the edge of military defeat, but of political collapse. Amid this chaos, Marius became more than a soldier. He became a symbol. To the Senate, he was a dangerous upstart who threatened their ancient privileges. To the people, he was the voice of hope, the man who would cleanse Rome of its shame. His election as consul was not merely a political victory, it was a declaration of war against the old order. The patricians gritted their teeth, but the mob cheered, chanting his name in the Forum as if he were already a savior. Yet even as Marius prepared to take command in Africa, the Republic's fractures deepened. Senators muttered conspiracies, fearing that if a man of humble birth could rise to supreme power, then the very foundations of their world were in danger. Old families whose ancestors had marched with Camillus, Fabius, and Scipio now found themselves rivaled by a novus homo who owed them nothing. Rome was entering uncharted waters, where birth and tradition could no longer guarantee dominance. The war in Numidia was no longer just a struggle against Jugurtha. It had become a struggle within Rome itself. A war of ideals between old and new, between corruption and reform, between privilege and merit. The deserts of Africa might decide Jugurtha's fate, but the streets of Rome would decide the Republic's destiny. And in those tense days, with the Senate trembling, the people restless, and the gods silent, it seemed that Rome stood at the edge of a chasm. One misstep, one further disgrace, and the Republic might collapse into ruin. Yet out of that turmoil, one truth grew clearer with every passing day. Rome could no longer survive as she had before. She would either be reborn in fire or be consumed by it. To understand the nightmare that Rome faced in Africa, one must first understand the man who conjured it, Jugurtha, king of Numidia. He was no mere barbarian chieftain, nor a reckless warlord drunk on blood and plunder. Jugurtha was something far more dangerous, a cunning strategist, a master of deceit, and a ruler who understood both the weaknesses of his enemies and the strengths of his own people. Jugurtha had been raised in the Numidian court, but had also spent years among the Romans themselves. As a young man, he had fought alongside Scipio Aemilianus during the siege of Numantia in Spain. There, he had watched Rome's armies at work, learned their discipline, admired their power, and studied their flaws. He saw how ambition divided generals, how greed corrupted decisions, how arrogance blinded commanders to subtle dangers. Rome had unknowingly tutored him in the art of war, and when Jugurtha returned to Numidia, he returned not only as a prince, but as a weapon sharpened by Rome itself. His seizure of power was ruthless. To secure his throne, Jugurtha murdered rivals with calculated efficiency. Blood washed through the palaces of Numidia, but the killings were not reckless. They were deliberate moves on a chessboard, removing every piece that might threaten his ascension. When Rome demanded explanation, Jugurtha sent gifts, When senators questioned his crimes, he bribed them into silence. He quickly discovered that Roman gold could buy not only peace but legitimacy. His infamous remark, "Rome is a city for sale and doomed to perish if it ever finds a buyer," was not born of arrogance alone. It was born of experience. Once Rome declared war, Jugurtha unleashed a strategy that no Roman general had ever mastered: guerrilla warfare. Numidia was his battlefield, and he bent it to his will. The deserts became allies, the hills became fortresses, and the swift Numidian cavalry became the scourge of Roman legions. His horsemen, lightly armed but fleet as the wind, could strike without warning, showering the enemy with javelins before vanishing into the sands. Against Rome's heavy infantry, disciplined but slow, Jugurtha's forces were ghosts, appearing suddenly, killing mercilessly, and then dissolving into nothingness. Roman commanders, accustomed to set-piece battles on open plains, found themselves confounded. They marched under the blazing African sun, their armor burning against their skin, their throats parched, their formations strained by endless harassment. By the time they reached the battlefield, Jugurtha allowed them to see their strength was spent, and then he would vanish again, leaving them stranded in the wilderness, mocked by his elusive shadow. Jugurtha's brilliance lay not only in speed but in patience. He never sought to crush Rome outright. He knew he could not. Instead, he sought to bleed her, to exhaust her, to turn her victories into dust. When Rome took a town, he withdrew into the hills. When Rome fortified a position, he raided its supplies. He struck at night, at dawn, at the very moment when Rome believed she had secured control. The war became not a series of decisive clashes, but a grinding, endless torment, a contest of endurance where Rome's pride was worn away by 1,000 cuts. Nor was Jugurtha merely a warrior. He was a diplomat, a manipulator who understood that Rome's greatest weakness was not in the field, but in her Senate. He bribed officials, sowed discord, and played upon the divisions between factions. At times, he offered peace, knowing full well that the gold he sent would buy him more time than any fortress could. At other times, he betrayed his own allies, sacrificing them to keep Rome off balance. In Numidia, loyalty was measured in survival, and Jugurtha excelled in keeping his enemies guessing who would stand beside him and who would be cast aside. The Numidians themselves followed him with fervor. To them, Jugurtha was more than a king. He was a champion of their independence, the shield against Roman domination. His charisma bound tribes together, forging unity where there had once been division. Men who might otherwise have feuded among themselves now rode side by side, united by Jugurtha's vision and Rome's arrogance. His soldiers did not fight for pay. They fought for freedom, for their king, and for the right to defy the greatest power in the known world. To Rome, this made Jugurtha doubly dangerous. He was not simply a rebel to be crushed, nor a bandit to be hunted. He was a leader whose cause inspired devotion, whose knowledge of Roman tactics allowed him to counter them, and whose cunning in politics outmatched many of Rome's own statesmen. He humiliated consuls, shattered armies, and left the Republic's honor in ruins. For years, he seemed untouchable, a phantom who struck where he pleased and escaped when he chose. But Jugurtha's greatest weapon was time. Every year the war dragged on, Rome bled. Her soldiers returned in disgrace. Her treasury groaned, her allies questioned her might, and her people seethed with anger. Jugurtha understood that he did not need to defeat Rome in one grand battle. He only needed to show the world that Rome could be resisted. That knowledge alone was poison to the Republic's aura of invincibility, and so Jugurtha loomed over Rome like a shadow. In him, the Republic faced not only an enemy of flesh and blood, but an enemy of ideas. He was the embodiment of everything Rome feared. The corruption of her leaders exposed, the weakness of her armies revealed, the limits of her power made plain. Against such a foe, Rome could not rely on tradition, could not depend on old glories. She would need something new, someone new. But until that savior could bring his vision to life, Jugurtha remained the master of Numidia, the scourge of Roman pride, and the living proof that even Rome could bleed. Rome had bled long enough. The deserts of Africa had humiliated her legions, the Senate's corruption had shamed her honor, and Jugurtha's cunning had mocked her power. Yet in the midst of this chaos, one man stepped forward. not with empty promises, but with a vision bold enough to reshape the Republic itself. His name was Gaius Marius, and he would not merely fight a war, he would build a new Rome. When Marius took command in 107 BC, he inherited an army broken in spirit and crippled by tradition. The legions of old were built on the backs of citizen farmers, men who left their plows to march for the Republic, then returned home when the campaign ended. But the wars of the late Republic were no longer seasonal, nor confined to Italy. They stretched across deserts, mountains, and seas, dragging on for years. The small landowners could no longer sustain both farm and battlefield. Rome's armies shrank, her ranks thinned, and her enemies grew bold. Marius saw the truth that others refused to admit. Rome's traditional army was dying. If Rome was to survive Jugurtha, if she was to face the storms yet to come, she needed something new. And so Marius enacted the most radical reform in the history of the Republic. He opened the legions to the cepit censei, the head count, the poorest citizens who owned no property and thus had never before been allowed to serve. To the Senate it was madness, arming the destitute, the desperate, the landless masses. But to Marius it was genius. He gave the poor not only bread, but purpose. He transformed Rome's outcasts into soldiers of steel. The Marian reforms reshaped everything. For the first time, the state provided weapons and armor, ensuring that every recruit was equipped to fight. Training was merciless, instilling discipline until the poorest shepherd could march and maneuver as a veteran. Standards became sacred, each eagle a symbol not only of a legion's pride, but of Rome's rebirth. No longer were soldiers tied to fleeting farms. They were tied to their general, bound by loyalty and survival. The legions became a professional force, capable of waging war year after year, wherever Rome demanded. The old guard scoffed, warning that such soldiers would be loyal to commanders rather than to the Senate. But the people cheered. For the first time, Rome's poor had a path to honor, wealth, and land. Veterans would be rewarded with settlements, their service repaid not with empty speeches, but with tangible hope. Marius gave Rome more than an army. He gave her a bond between citizen and soldier that was stronger than tradition itself. With his new legions forged, Marius turned his eyes once more to Africa. Jugurtha still roamed free, still mocked the Republic with every raid and every bribe. But now the tide was shifting. The Romans no longer marched as exhausted farmers. They marched as hardened professionals, drilled to endure desert heat, trained to maneuver against swift cavalry, armed with resilience as much as with steel. The war, once Rome's shame, was becoming Rome's crucible. Yet even Marius could not triumph alone. By his side rose a figure who, though at first overshadowed, would leave his own mark upon history: Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Where Marius embodied the iron will of reform, Sulla embodied the art of guile. Born into a patrician family fallen into poverty, Sulla understood both the pride of Rome's nobility and the desperation of Rome's poor. He was ambitious, brilliant, and ruthless, a man whose charm concealed a dangerous cunning. Together, Marius and Sulla formed an unlikely partnership. Marius commanded the legions, transforming them into a war machine. Sulla worked in the shadows, weaving webs of diplomacy and deceit. Where Jugurtha thrived on alliances and bribes, Sulla countered with his own cunning. He turned rival kings against Jugurtha, whispering promises of Rome's favor, offering power in exchange for betrayal. Slowly, methodically, the circle tightened. Jugurtha, once untouchable, began to feel the noose. His allies faltered, tempted by Sulla's gold and Rome's promises. His soldiers, once inspired, began to doubt as Roman victories grew. The desert that had once protected him now seemed smaller, less secure. Rome was learning, adapting, evolving into a predator that even Jugurtha could not outrun. Marius pressed the war with relentless determination. He drove his men through long marches, struck at Jugurtha's strongholds, and denied him rest. No longer would the Numidian king dictate the pace of battle. Rome would hunt him day and night, across plains and mountains, through drought and storm. The new legions, hardened by reform, endured where old armies had faltered. Jugurtha's raids still stung, but they no longer broke the Romans. For every ambush, Marius answered with persistence. For every trick, Sulla answered with counter-trick. It was not merely a military campaign, it was a transformation. The Republic itself was being reforged in the African furnace. Soldiers who had once cursed their fate now marched with pride, knowing they were part of something greater. Citizens in Rome, once ashamed of the Senate's corruption, now cheered as news of progress spread. The Republic, so close to collapse, was breathing again. And yet, beneath the triumph, shadows stirred. For in binding soldiers to generals rather than to the Senate, Marius had planted seeds that would one day shake the Republic to its core. His reforms gave Rome strength in the moment, but also gave rise to a new breed of commander. Men whose power was built not on the authority of the Senate, but on the loyalty of legions. Sulla, watching and learning, understood this truth well. But that reckoning was yet to come. For now, Rome was reborn. In Marius, the people found their champion. In his reforms, the Republic found renewal. And in the partnership with Sulla, Rome found the cunning needed to finally outwit Jugurtha. The tide had turned. The deserts that had once devoured Roman pride would soon echo with Rome's vengeance. Jugurtha's time was running out, and the fire of Africa was about to consume its own master. The desert had grown weary of Jugurtha's defiance. Once, his shadow stretched across Numidia like that of a lion, proud and untouchable. Now it flickered like a dying flame. For years he had laughed at Rome, outwitting generals, bribing senators, vanishing into sands while the legions stumbled. But Jugurtha's laughter was fading. The hunter had become the hunted. The final act began not with steel alone, but with betrayal. Jugurtha's greatest weapon, his ability to weave alliances through gold and fear, now turned against him. King Bacchus of Mauritania, his father-in-law and longtime ally, grew weary of war's endless toll. Rome, through Sulla's silken words and promises of favor, offered Bacchus a new path: betray Jugurtha and secure his own throne in Rome's grace. Bacchus wavered, torn between loyalty to blood and the lure of survival. Jugurtha, still proud, trusted him, believing that kinship would triumph where armies had failed. But Sulla was relentless. He painted visions of Rome's wrath, of legions that would never rest until Jugurtha was ashes in the sand. He promised Bacchus not only peace but power, and in the end, ambition triumphed over kinship. In a scene as dramatic as any battle, Bacchus lured Jugurtha into an ambush under the guise of negotiation. Surrounded by supposed allies, Jugurtha realized too late the jaws had closed. He was seized, bound in chains, and delivered into Sulla's hands. The desert king who had humiliated Rome for nearly a decade now stood broken, betrayed by the very system of alliances he had once mastered. When word reached Marius, the warlord of Numidia allowed himself a rare smile. The war was over. The Republic, so long mocked, had its vengeance. Jugurtha's capture was not simply a victory, it was vindication, proof that Rome could not be broken by corruption, nor defeated by cunning. The triumph that followed in Rome was a spectacle of rebirth. Crowds poured into the streets as Marius paraded through the city, the legions marching in gleaming ranks behind him. Standards glittered, trumpets blared, and the people roared their approval. Behind the chariots of victory shuffled Jugurtha himself, shackled, his proud head bowed. The man who had once sneered at the Senate now stumbled before its people, a living testament to Rome's resurrection. In the depths of the Tullianum prison, Jugurtha's fate was sealed. Stripped of his crown, his gold, and his freedom, he was thrown into the darkness. There the king, who had once ruled with fire and cunning, died in chains, his final breath swallowed by stone. His fall was Rome's triumph, and with it the war that had nearly broken the Republic came to its end. But the true climax was not Jugurtha's fall, it was Rome's rebirth. The Marian reforms had forged a new army, one that could endure the deserts of Africa and the treacheries of foreign kings. Marius himself emerged as the champion of the people, hailed as the savior who restored Rome's honor. His name echoed through the forum, whispered with awe and fear alike. Yet in the shadows of this triumph stood Sulla, quietly savoring his own victory. It was his cunning that had secured Jugurtha's capture, his diplomacy that had bent Bacchus to Rome's will. Though Marius basked in the glory, Sulla carried within him the certainty that his time would come. The seeds of rivalry were sown in the very hour of triumph. Rome, reborn in fire, stood taller than ever before. The deserts had taught her new lessons, that corruption could bring her to her knees, but resilience could lift her higher, that her enemies could outwit her generals, but never her destiny. The Republic had stared into the abyss of humiliation and emerged forged anew. And yet, though the people cheered and the Senate basked in reflected glory, history knew better. Marius's reforms, while saving Rome, had reshaped the very soul of the Republic. The legions, once loyal to the Senate, were now bound to their commanders. Soldiers looked to generals for land, loot, and survival. The line between Rome's army and Rome's politics had blurred forever. Jugurtha was gone, but in his wake he left a republic transformed, invulnerable. For while Marius stood at the height of glory and Sulla bided his time in patience, the future already trembled with civil wars, rivalries, and the slow unraveling of the old order. For now, however, Rome rejoiced. The eagle had risen again from the desert sands, her wings stronger than before, her cry echoing across the Mediterranean. Jugurtha's defiance was crushed. Numidia lay subdued, and the world was reminded that though Rome might falter, she would never fall. The desert fire had tested the Republic, and from that fire Rome was reborn.